The dining room of the Aurelian Chicago's most exclusive and fiercely guarded culinary sanctuary gleamed like a hollowed-out diamond against the bitter cold of the Midwestern winter night. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring vaulted ceilings like frozen waterfalls, casting a brilliant fractured illumination over the impeccably ironed white linen tablecloths and the empty waiting crystal goblets. The first toast of the evening was always the sacred hour when the city's elite gathered to forge ruthless corporate alliances, celebrate inherited fortunes, and parade matrimonial engagements that were heavily negotiated in society pages long before any genuine vows were spoken. Tucked away at the absolute best table in the far back, a secluded alcove reserved strictly for those who could purchase the extravagant luxury of silence and distance, sat Adrian Lancaster. Beside him, his lifelong business partner and closest confidant Ethan Vance was murmuring the final intricate clauses of a massive real estate merger that would inevitably shift the financial tectonic plates of the entire city. Yet, for all the billions hovering in the air, Adrian was barely registering a single word his partner said. His sharp, calculating eyes were completely anchored to the breathtaking woman currently navigating her way through the maze of tables, effortlessly drawing the breathless stares of the room as though the very atmosphere bowed in reverence to her flawless elegance. Brooke Sterling possessed the deliberate predatory grace of someone who had never once in her life asked for permission to occupy a space moving with a cultivated arrogance that demanded absolute submission from onlookers. She slid into the plush velvet seat directly across from Adrian, flashing a highly rehearsed, dazzling smile that lacked any true warmth, but held enough voltage to blind the untrained eye. Extending her manicured hand, she allowed Adrian to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a silent, triumphant broadcast to the hushed murmurs of the dining room that this coveted billionaire and this spectacular night belonged entirely to her. She began twisting the magnificent blinding diamond engagement ring that sat heavy on her finger, her voice dripping with a honeyed entitlement as she leaned in close. She proudly declared that she wanted the entire city of Chicago, every envious socialite and doubting critic, to know unequivocally that Adrian had chosen her above all others to share his vast empire. Adrian offered a measured, quiet confirmation, his voice carrying the immovable, quiet certainty that is only bred from decades of accumulating unimaginable wealth, gently suggesting they enjoy their dinner like civilized people before the grand spectacle truly began. It was in that exact fragile pause between the clinking of silver and the hushed symphony of wealth that she appeared, cutting through the heavy pretension of the room with an almost ethereal grounding. The waitress approached their secluded table with a heavy silver tray held aloft, her steps measured and firm, her posture remarkably straight. Wearing a perfectly starched uniform and an apron tied with militant precision, she navigated the crowded, bustling floor with a profound, quiet serenity that aggressively contrasted with the frantic, nervous energy of the younger staff members who were terrified of displeasing the wealthy patrons. There was something undeniably different about her, a strange, ancient calm radiating from her steady gaze, suggesting that absolutely nothing in this terrifyingly opulent world of privilege and power could ever intimidate her spirit. Her name was Victoria Carter, a woman whose life had been etched with unseen battles, and although the affluent trio sitting comfortably at the table remained blissfully ignorant, her quiet arrival was about to violently fracture their perfect evening into irreparably jagged pieces. She offered a soft, meticulously polite evening greeting, her voice carrying the soothing rhythm of a gentle tide, asking for permission to pour their chilled water while they perused the leather-bound menus. With an exact practiced movement, Victoria tilted the heavy crystal pitcher over Brooke's glass, the pure water cascading flawlessly without a single errant drop disturbing the pristine white fabric of the table. However, Brooke, who had spent the entirety of her evening desperately hunting for a grand stage to assert her newfound dominance, instantly recognized this minor interaction as her perfect long-awaited opportunity to perform. Raising a hand with sudden aggressive hostility, she loudly interrupted the pour, her voice slicing through the ambient jazz music, questioning with cruel mock incredulity if the establishment had forgotten to teach its staff to serve the gentleman first. The nasty condescending remark dropped into the quiet luxury of the restaurant like a heavy stone plunging into a still pond, immediately freezing the polite chatter at the surrounding tables. Ethan slowly raised his eyes from the dense legal documents, his face tightening with embarrassment, while Adrian simply frowned deeply, uncomfortable with the public display of cruelty, yet remaining silently complicit. The nearby patrons subtly lowered the volume of their conversations, leaning in slightly, the entire glittering dining room collectively sharpening its collective ear to witness the inevitable destruction of a working-class employee. Victoria did not flinch, her steady hands remaining perfectly still, refusing to grant the haughty socialite the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of humiliation cross her dignified, lined face. She offered a soft, flawlessly professional apology to the young woman, her tone remaining completely neutral, and gracefully moved around the table to fill Adrian's glass instead, hoping to diffuse the escalating tension. But Brooke was far from finished. Something deep within the unshakable composure of this older woman fiercely irritated her, scratching at a buried insecurity she could neither name nor control. The waitress's unwavering calm acted as a terrifying reflective mirror in which Brooke absolutely refused to look, prompting her to stubbornly push her glass forward, causing it to wobble dangerously and spill a few drops onto the immaculate linen. Brooke's voice rose an octave, demanding that everyone look at the audacity of the staff, loudly proclaiming her exhaustion with people who falsely believed that wearing a uniform granted them a rightful place in such a high society sanctuary. She aggressively demanded to know if the waitress had any concept of the immense power of the man sitting across from her, pushing the confrontation past the point of simple rudeness into a realm of outright cruelty. Adrian, finally sensing the dangerous tipping point of the situation, placed a heavy, calming hand on the table, softly murmuring Brooke's name in a clear attempt to end the unnecessary public humiliation. Brooke viciously cut him off, refusing to break her intense, furious glare from the waitress, demanding that the older woman look her directly in the eyes and state her name so she could ensure she was permanently fired from the premises. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. A young waiter froze mid-step his tray, shaking violently, while Ethan lowered his head in profound shame, and Adrian suddenly felt his iron grip on the situation slipping away. Victoria slowly placed the heavy crystal pitcher onto the table with a deliberate, terrifyingly deliberate slowness that sent an unexpected chill crawling up the spines of everyone seated nearby. She raised her proud face, looking directly into Brooke's blazing eyes, and smiled not with mockery nor with rage, but with the haunting, profound recognition of someone gazing upon a ghost from a buried past. Victoria stated her name with crystal clarity, her voice echoing gently through the silent room, before softly suggesting that the truly terrifying question was not if she knew who Brooke was, but whether Brooke remembered exactly who she used to be. The silence that instantly descended upon the grand dining room was absolute, a suffocating vacuum that swallowed the soft jazz music and the clinking of fine silverware whole. Brooke blinked rapidly, her previously triumphant smile freezing halfway on her beautifully painted face, transforming instantly into a brittle, grotesque mask that suddenly failed to fit the contours of her panic. Something dark and ancient darted swiftly behind her meticulously lined eyes, a rapid, frantic flash of profound terror that only an incredibly observant witness would have recognized as a ghost rising from the grave. It was a deeply buried, rotting fear that she had desperately spent over a decade burying beneath designer clothes and millions of dollars. A fear she foolishly believed had been successfully entombed forever. Her voice, which only moments before had been sharp enough to cut glass, entirely lost its razor edge as she stammered a weak, unconvincing denial, frantically insisting that she had absolutely no idea what the waitress was talking about. She claimed with a desperation that betrayed her elegant facade that she had never laid eyes on this woman in her entire life, her breathing growing shallow as she desperately tried to maintain her crumbling reality. Victoria did not raise her tone even a fraction of an inch, maintaining that same unnerving oceanic calm as she countered the billionaire's fiancé with devastating quiet certainty. She noted how remarkably curious Brooke's sudden amnesia was, considering that Victoria possessed a flawlessly clear photographic memory of Brooke's trembling hands, the desperate pitch of her crying voice, and above all the torrential rain of the very last night they had shared a space. Adrian shifted his gaze rapidly between the unshakable waitress and his suddenly terrified fiancée, a deep, unsettling confusion taking root in his chest as Ethan leaned forward, his legal mind sensing a massive hidden liability. At the neighboring tables, the wealthy patrons had completely abandoned any polite pretense of ignoring the drama, their eyes locked eagerly on the unfolding disaster at the coveted back table. Brooke let out a high, incredibly nervous laugh that failed to convince a single soul in the room, her voice shaking as she wildly declared the waitress insane, begging Adrian to use his power to have the woman thrown out into the freezing Chicago street. She aggressively pleaded with him not to allow a deranged lying employee to ruin their perfect celebration, her manicured fingers digging painfully into the edge of the heavy wooden table. But Adrian Lancaster, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar real estate empire by flawlessly reading the microscopic cracks in his rival's armor, remained absolutely frozen in his velvet chair. For the very first time in his meticulously controlled existence, his sharp predatory instincts screamed at him to remain perfectly quiet and observe the catastrophic unraveling happening right before his eyes. The desperate, frantic tremor he heard echoing in Brooke's voice was not the righteous indignation of an insulted socialite. It was the raw, unadulterated panic of a guilty soul backed into a corner. He raised a single commanding finger, uttering a slow, deliberate command to wait a solitary word, carrying such immense weight that the approaching restaurant manager immediately stopped dead in his tracks. He softly instructed that the waitress be allowed to finish her sentence, a request that caused Brooke to whip her head around her eyes wide with a mixture of profound betrayal and escalating horror. When she frantically demanded to know why he was listening to the help over his future wife, Adrian replied with a terrifying core of cold steel in his voice, stating he simply needed to understand what was truly happening. Victoria took a slight, respectful step to the side, positioning herself so she could look directly at both of them without completely turning her back on the whispering room. There was no triumphant malice in her lined face, no twisted joy in the public spectacle. Instead, she wore a profound, heavy sorrow, the terrible exhaustion of someone who has carried a crushing secret for nearly 2 decades. She quietly explained that she had never actively sought Brooke out, that she had taken this grueling job simply to survive the harsh economic realities of the city, just like thousands of other invisible workers. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony, placing her at the exact table of the woman whose past she held, noting that had Brooke not chosen to publicly humiliate her, she would have remained a silent ghost forever. Adrian, his heart pounding with a strange, inexplicable dread, leaned forward and asked the waitress what specific question required such immense courage to finally ask his trembling fiancée. Victoria took a deep, shuddering breath, her calm facade cracking just a fraction, and focused her piercing eyes entirely on Brooke, asking softly if amidst all this suffocating luxury she ever thought about the little boy she had left behind in the storm. The heavy crystal water goblet slipped directly through Brooke's numb fingers, crashing onto the table and sending a massive, unstoppable stain of water spreading across the pristine white linen and Ethan's incredibly important legal contracts. Nobody at the table made even the slightest attempt to salvage the documents or dab at the mess, the physical spill completely irrelevant compared to the massive psychological detonation that had just leveled the alcove. Adrian slowly turned his entire body toward his terrified fiancée, a massive, life-altering question violently etched into every single tense muscle of his usually composed, stoic face. He softly spoke her name, but the rich, resonant confidence that usually defined the billionaire was completely hollowed out, replaced by the fragile, trembling voice of a deeply confused man. He begged her to explain exactly what child the waitress was talking about, his mind desperately racing to connect dots he didn't even know existed within the carefully curated history of the woman he loved. Brooke opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, ragged breath escaped. Her chest heaved violently as the immaculate bulletproof elegance she had worn like armor completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Brooke finally managed to force a microscopic thread of sound from her paralyzed throat, weakly whispering that the entire story was a malicious, fabricated lie designed to extort them. Victoria, radiating a devastating, immovable serenity, challenged the younger woman to look her directly in the eyes and repeat that cowardly denial, daring her to claim she had no memory of the child in question. The waitress then turned her sorrowful gaze to Adrian, advising the billionaire to closely observe his fiancée to see if she could lie to him with the exact same terrifying ease she was currently using to lie to herself. The luxurious restaurant felt as though it had been violently plunged into a vacuum. The string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing. The staff remained frozen like marble statues, and the air crackled with unbearable tension. Adrian reached out and grabbed Brooke's hand, finding it as cold as a block of winter ice, and desperately begged her to just confirm it was a lie so they could immediately flee the building. But Brooke simply stared at him, tears finally spilling over her dark lashes and ruining her perfect makeup. Her devastating silence screamed louder than any confession, prompting Adrian to slowly drop her hand as if he had just touched a complete stranger. The immediate days following the disastrous dinner at the Aurelian completely transformed Adrian Lancaster, stripping away the ruthless corporate titan and leaving behind a desperate, haunted shell of a man. The billionaire, who previously calculated every single minute of his heavily guarded schedule as though it were solid gold, began inexplicably vanishing from massive board meetings, randomly delegating multi-million-dollar contracts, and disappearing for hours on end into the city. Ethan covered for his unraveling partner as best as he could, spinning webs of excuses to angry investors. But the brilliant lawyer knew deep down that his friend no longer belonged to the lucrative world of real estate. Adrian was entirely consumed by a singular agonizing mission he desperately needed to locate the physical records of the now-defunct St. Rose Haven, an old orphanage that had served the poorest neighborhoods of Chicago decades ago. He needed concrete, undeniable proof before he could confidently accuse Brooke of the ultimate betrayal, and more importantly, before he could ever dare to look the abandoned boy in the eyes. The frantic search was excruciatingly difficult, as the charitable institution had shuttered years ago, its fragile paper archives carelessly scattered across dusty municipal basements and forgotten storage facilities on the south side. Late one freezing afternoon, after moving heaven and earth and spending thousands of dollars on private investigators, Ethan slowly walked into Adrian's massive glass office, his usually sharp face pale and incredibly grave. He held a fragile yellowing cardboard folder in his trembling hands, quietly announcing to the silent room that he had finally found the official intake registry from that specific torrential night 17 years ago. Adrian stood up with such violent, desperate speed that his heavy leather executive chair crashed backward onto the floor, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he snatched the ancient file from his closest friend. There, written in beautiful, meticulous cursive on a water-stained page, was the clinical documentation of a tragedy. A male infant received in the early hours of the morning, discovered on the front steps during a severe thunderstorm. The record stated the child had no identifying documentation, no desperate letter of explanation, absolutely no name. And at the very bottom sat the distinct, elegant signature of the nurse who had taken responsibility for his life, Victoria Carter. Adrian stared at the faded ink, his brilliant mind instantly comparing the date to the darkest, most agonizing day of his entire life, the very day Brooke had tearfully sworn to him that their son had been stillborn. The fragile cardboard folder slipped from Adrian's numb fingers, scattering the ancient papers across the expensive Persian rug, as Ethan stepped forward, his voice a barely audible heartbroken whisper, confirming the horrific truth. The baby had not died in the hospital. Brooke had deliberately abandoned him in the freezing rain that exact same morning, only to return to their luxury apartment and perform a weeping, devastated charade. Ethan stood completely paralyzed, entirely unsure of how to comfort a man whose entire reality had just been violently shattered, opting to simply rest a heavy grounding hand on his shattered friend's shaking shoulder. The two powerful men remained perfectly still in the towering glass office, standing silently before a devastating revelation that was far too heavy for the human heart to process in a single lifetime. When Ethan finally found the courage to ask what the next step would be, Adrian slowly knelt and gathered the scattered papers with a delicate, almost holy reverence, as if holding the beating heart of the son he had mourned for nearly 2 decades. Adrian declared that he was going to meet his son, but fiercely swore he would not violently disrupt the boy's life like a ghost, demanding restitution. He would approach with profound respect, which meant speaking to Victoria first. The very next afternoon, Adrian managed to discover the location of Victoria's secondary job, arriving at a deeply modest working-class diner on the rougher edges of the city called the Warm Hearth. The sudden entrance of a man wearing a bespoke, incredibly expensive Italian suit instantly silenced the clattering dishes and low conversations of the tired laborers enjoying their cheap afternoon meals. However, Adrian had absolutely no interest in the staring patrons. His desperate, searching eyes were entirely locked on the older woman emerging from the greasy kitchen, balancing a heavy tray of plates. Victoria recognized the billionaire instantly, her heart leaping into her throat as she quickly abandoned the heavy tray on the worn Formica counter, walking toward him with a quiet, fierce protectiveness radiating from her posture. She kept her voice incredibly low, so the curious customers could not eavesdrop, harshly reminding him that she had explicitly begged him never to seek her out, demanding that he leave her innocent son alone. Adrian agreed softly, swearing on his life that he had no intention of causing harm, but pleaded with her to look at one specific document promising to vanish forever if she commanded it after seeing the truth. Adrian slowly pulled the yellowing orphanage intake form from his breast pocket, offering it to the wary mother, who hesitated for a long, agonizing moment before finally taking the fragile paper. She instantly recognized the archaic format of the defunct St. Rose Haven, tracing her own faded signature with a trembling finger, completely unaware of the devastating secondary truth the billionaire was about to unleash. With tears openly streaming down his weathered face, Adrian withdrew a small, worn photograph from his wallet, showing a much younger version of himself happily embracing a heavily pregnant Brooke. His voice broke into a jagged sob as he explained that the freezing infant she had miraculously saved that night was not abandoned by a desperately lonely, destitute single mother, as Brooke had led the world to believe. He confessed that the child had been viciously stolen from a fiercely loving father, who had spent his entire life mourning a tiny grave that never actually existed, revealing the crushing reality of his identity. The crowded, noisy diner seemingly dissolved into a silent, blurry void for Victoria. The clattering plates, the smell of grease, the staring customers all vanished, leaving only the impossible, heartbreaking truth that the man weeping before her was Matthew's true blood. Victoria opened her mouth to offer a response, her mind desperately struggling to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal this poor man had suffered, but the words completely failed to materialize in her throat. At that exact fragile second, the cheerful bell above the diner's front door chimed loudly, and a bright, incredibly warm young voice echoed through the establishment, completely oblivious to the massive emotional storm brewing inside. Matthew, carrying a heavy canvas backpack, announced proudly that he had finished his classes early and had come straight to the diner to help his mother survive the grueling dinner rush. Victoria spun around, her blood running completely cold, realizing that for the very first time in 18 years, her precious, brilliant son was standing mere feet away from the biological father he had been cruelly denied. Adrian stopped breathing entirely, staring at the handsome teenager as though he were witnessing a divine miracle, his eyes desperately searching the boy's face and instantly finding undeniable echoes of his own youth reflected in Matthew's smile. The terrified mother stood paralyzed between the two most important men in this tragic saga, terrifyingly aware that the massive, fragile secret she had protected for decades was on the absolute brink of a catastrophic explosion. The heavy atmosphere inside the warm hearth felt as though it had been violently suspended in amber, trapping Victoria as she watched her vibrant, smiling son casually drop his heavy canvas backpack onto a nearby chair. Matthew approached the worn Formica counter with the boundless golden energy of youth, throwing a warm, affectionate arm around his mother's trembling shoulders, proudly announcing that he hadn't stayed late at the library, just so he could help her scrub tables. Victoria felt her knees severely buckle beneath her, her panicked eyes darting desperately between the towering billionaire who had just shattered her reality and the innocent boy who was the absolute center of it all. She somehow managed to force a thin, incredibly shaky voice past the massive lump of terror in her throat, awkwardly introducing the devastatingly wealthy stranger merely as a new customer who had come to discuss a private matter. Adrian found himself completely incapable of speaking a single word. His wide, wet eyes were aggressively locked onto the boy's face, obsessively tracing the strong jawline, the familiar tilt of the head, and the deep, soulful eyes that mirrored his own. It was a profoundly surreal, agonizingly beautiful experience, like staring into a magical mirror that reflected a stolen, alternate timeline of his own life, a living, breathing ghost constructed from the ashes of his deepest grief. Matthew, raised with an incredibly deep, inherent respect for others, politely extended his hand toward the wealthy stranger, completely unaware of the massive tectonic shift occurring in the room, casually offering to brew the man the absolute best cup of coffee on the South Side. Adrian slowly reached out, and the very second his trembling palm made physical contact with the boy's strong, warm hand, a violent shockwave of pure electricity shot straight up his arm and anchored itself deeply into his fractured heart. The billionaire had to bite down on the inside of his cheek with extreme punishing force to stop himself from collapsing into a weeping heap right there on the sticky linoleum floor of the diner. He managed to choke out a raspy, incredibly fragile acceptance of the offer, watching in absolute awe as the boy enthusiastically ducked behind the counter, moving with the confident, joyful grace of someone who truly loved his life. While he expertly prepared the dark roast, Matthew chattered away happily, his voice a soothing balm, proudly sharing his intense driving ambition to gain entry into the local university, so he could eventually become a dedicated public school teacher. He passionately explained that his mother's greatest gift had been teaching him to read, and he desperately wanted to pass that specific salvation on to other lost, disadvantaged children who had absolutely nobody else in their corner. Adrian absorbed every single beautiful word the teenager spoke like a dying man, drinking from a miraculous oasis, utterly mesmerized by the profound goodness radiating from a boy raised completely without wealth or biological privilege. This incredible young man, who had been brutally discarded on a freezing concrete step and raised on meager waitress tips, spoke only of boundless generosity and giving back, miraculously transforming the deep wound of his abandonment into a wellspring of profound empathy. Adrian managed to steady his shaking voice, just enough to softly comment that Victoria must be unbelievably proud of the incredible selfless young man she had managed to raise against such astronomical odds. Matthew immediately corrected him with a bright, genuine laugh, fiercely declaring that he was the one who was intensely proud of her, passionately detailing the grueling, back-breaking sacrifices she had quietly made over the years so he would never go hungry. The boy swore a solemn, unbreakable vow right then and there that the very moment he received his first official teaching paycheck, he was going to forcefully retire his mother, finally allowing her to rest and be taken care of for the remainder of her life. Victoria's eyes flooded with hot, silent tears, but it was Adrian who was forced to abruptly turn his face toward the rain-streaked window, desperately hiding the uncontrollable silent sobbing that racked his broad shoulders. When a loud group of tired construction workers pushed through the diner doors demanding service, Matthew immediately sprang into action, cheerfully grabbing menus and leaving his mother alone with the emotional wreckage of the wealthy stranger. Victoria leaned in close, her voice a desperate, urgent whisper, begging the billionaire to leave the premises immediately before his fragile composure shattered completely and alerted the highly observant teenager to the massive deception. Adrian frantically wiped his face, pleading for just 5 more minutes of her time in absolute privacy, swearing on his life that he would vanish into the city the second they concluded their agonizing conversation. Reluctantly, Victoria signaled a co-worker to briefly cover her station, leading the imposing billionaire into the cramped, incredibly narrow storage room at the back of the kitchen, shutting the heavy wooden door beneath a single flickering fluorescent bulb. The two exhausted adults stood surrounded by towering, precarious stacks of canned goods and paper napkins, looking at each other not as bitter enemies, but as two deeply wounded souls forced to carry the exact same unimaginable burden of sorrow. Adrian reached into his tailored jacket and produced the same faded photograph of a pregnant Brooke, his voice dropping to a haunted, hollow whisper as he finally began to unveil the deepest, most agonizing secret of his existence. Adrian confessed that on the horrific night Brooke returned to their apartment with empty arms, spinning the elaborate, devastating lie of a stillbirth, he had collapsed onto the sterile hospital floor, violently weeping for a child he was never allowed to hold. He revealed that in the suffocating darkness of his intense grief, he had secretly chosen a powerful name for the boy he believed was buried in an unmarked grave, a name he had never possessed the immense courage to speak aloud to another living soul. With tears spilling freely, Adrian whispered that the secret name he had chosen in his broken heart all those years ago was Matthew, a revelation that caused the small, cramped room to spin violently around the terrified mother. Victoria gasped loudly, aggressively, covering her mouth with both hands, frantically whispering that it was completely impossible, as she was the one who had chosen that exact name while watching the tiny, freezing infant sleep in the orphanage. She had specifically chosen the strong biblical name because she fiercely believed the abandoned child needed a powerful protective shield against a cruel world utterly unaware that she was echoing the exact desires of a grieving father miles away. Adrian smiled through his immense pain, suggesting that perhaps despite the cruel separation, the unbreakable, mystical bond between a father and son had somehow magically guided her choice, weaving their tragic destinies together in the dark. Adrian fell to his knees in the cramped storage room, staring up at the exhausted waitress, passionately swearing on everything holy that he had absolutely no intention of violently ripping the boy away from the only mother he had ever known. He acknowledged with profound respect that Victoria had built the boy's incredible character, begging only for her cautious permission to remain quietly in the periphery, getting to know the teenager slowly until the right, safe moment arrived to reveal the crushing truth. Victoria stared down at the pleading billionaire, desperately searching his tear-streaked face for any hidden trace of the arrogant, commanding monster she had confronted in the restaurant, finding only a profoundly broken father, begging for a second chance. After an agonizing, heavy silence, she slowly nodded her head, granting him permission to be near, but issuing a fierce, ironclad warning that if his presence caused the boy even a fraction of pain, she would banish him forever. Meanwhile, miles away in the towering glass offices of the financial district, Ethan Vance was deeply buried in the dusty, neglected archives of the defunct orphanage, obsessively hunting for any detail that might explain Brooke's monstrous actions. What the brilliant lawyer discovered within the fragile, crumbling pages of an ancient visitor logbook would completely destroy the simple, black-and-white narrative they had all comfortably accepted, proving that the agonizing truth was far more complicated and infinitely more tragic than any of them could have possibly imagined. The heavy, oppressive silence inside Adrian's sprawling corner office felt thick enough to suffocate a man when Ethan finally arrived carrying the crumbling, mold-scented visitor logbook from the long-shuttered St. Rose Haven orphanage. The brilliant attorney gently placed the fragile artifact onto the massive mahogany desk, his face grim and pale, warning his lifelong friend that the simple narrative of Brooke being a heartless, calculating monster was about to be completely dismantled. Ethan pointed a shaking finger at a specific faded entry dated exactly 3 weeks after the torrential storm that had forever altered their lives, reading the scrawled administrative notes aloud to the paralyzed billionaire. The record explicitly detailed the frantic arrival of a deeply traumatized young woman who had desperately begged the staff to return the infant she had abandoned during the storm, weeping hysterically and claiming she had made a horrific, unforgivable mistake. However, because the terrified young mother possessed absolutely no legal documentation, and because the draconian rules of the institution strictly forbade showing wards to unverified strangers, the administrator on duty had coldly turned her away, locking the door on her desperate pleas. Adrian stared blindly at the yellowed page, feeling the solid ground beneath his expensive shoes violently shift and crack. The woman he had spent the last week actively despising with every fiber of his being had actually tried to save their son. Determined to hear the agonizing truth directly from the source, Adrian utilized his vast resources to track down the former orphanage administrator, a weary, elderly woman named Olivia Foster, who now lived in a tiny, cluttered apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. When Adrian gently presented her with a copy of the ancient logbook, the elderly woman instantly broke down into heavy, racking sobs, confessing that the memory of that hysterical, heartbroken girl had violently haunted her nightmares for the last 17 years. Olivia explained with crushing regret that she had merely been following the strict, unyielding protocols designed to protect vulnerable children from potential predators demanding the frantic girl return with proper legal paperwork before granting her access to the nursery. The elderly woman covered her face with trembling, age-spotted hands, weeping that the terrified girl had stumbled out into the freezing city streets, completely shattered. And despite Olivia's lingering hopes, she had never mustered the courage or resources to return. Adrian left the tiny, sad apartment feeling as though his own soul had been forcefully ripped from his chest. The cruel, unyielding bureaucracy of the system had permanently slammed the door on Brooke's redemption, fundamentally altering the trajectory of all their lives. He realized with sickening clarity that Brooke's subsequent descent into shallow luxury and pathological lying was not born of cold malice, but was a desperate psychological armor forged to survive an agonizing, insurmountable grief that nobody else was allowed to see. That very evening, Adrian bypassed his own luxury penthouse and traveled directly to Brooke's expansive apartment, finding the once glamorous socialite looking like a hollowed-out ghost, her usually flawless face, devoid of makeup, and deeply etched with profound exhaustion. She greeted him with a bitter, hollow laugh, assuming he had arrived to deliver the final crushing blow to their relationship in person, sarcastically thanking him for at least having the decency to look her in the eyes while destroying her. Instead, Adrian walked slowly into the vast, impeccably decorated living room and softly demanded she tell him the absolute truth about her past, promising he would not interrupt, finally offering her the safe space she had been denied for nearly 2 decades. Brooke collapsed onto a velvet sofa, her hands shaking violently as she finally confessed the horrifying reality of her own childhood, detailing her traumatic, loveless bouncing between abusive foster homes, where she learned that attachment only guaranteed excruciating pain. She explained that when she unexpectedly became pregnant while Adrian was constantly traveling to build his empire, she was consumed by a blinding, paralyzing terror that she was genetically destined to ruin the baby's life, just as hers had been ruined. In her fractured, desperately broken mind, leaving the infant on the steps of an institution seemed like the ultimate act of maternal sacrifice, a twisted logic convincing her that literally anyone else would be a superior, safer parent than a broken foster child. Brooke tearfully confessed that after abandoning her baby, she desperately tried to reclaim him, but was blocked by bureaucracy and convinced by a lawyer that fighting for custody would only traumatize the child. Believing she was sacrificing her own happiness for his future, she walked away and spent the next 17 years hiding unbearable guilt behind a glamorous lifestyle. Her revelation led Adrian to tell Victoria the truth, prompting Victoria to reveal her own tragic past. After losing her biological son, Thomas, because she could not afford life-saving heart surgery, she found the abandoned infant on the orphanage steps and devoted her life to raising him with unwavering love. Soon afterward, Brooke's emotional desperation led her to confront Matthew, directly forcing the hidden truth into the open before anyone was prepared. As Adrian and Victoria rushed through a violent storm to reach Matthew, Victoria was forced to admit that Brooke was indeed his birth mother, while assuring him that nothing could change the love she had given him. Adrian then revealed that he was Matthew's biological father, explaining he had been deceived into believing his child had died years earlier. Overwhelmed by the simultaneous revelations, Matthew fled into the city before eventually returning to the abandoned orphanage where his story had begun. There, Victoria comforted him by explaining that finding him had saved her own shattered life, while Brooke produced the tiny silver medal hidden inside his baby blanket, proving she had never abandoned him out of a lack of love. but because she was a frightened, impoverished young girl unable to protect him. Holding the treasured medal, Matthew gradually understood that his abandonment had been born of fear rather than cruelty. Although deeply hurt and needing time to heal, he chose forgiveness over hatred, affirming that Victoria would always remain his true mother, while leaving room in his heart for Brooke and Adrian. In the years that followed, Brooke dedicated her wealth to helping vulnerable teenage mothers. Adrian founded a charity funding pediatric heart surgeries in Thomas's memory, and Victoria finally retired after a lifetime of sacrifice. Matthew became a devoted public school teacher, serving disadvantaged children, demonstrating through his own life that compassion, forgiveness, and chosen family can overcome even the deepest wounds and transform tragedy into hope.